This is a Porsche 911, and this is also a Porsche 911. Now you can already see where I'm going with this, can't you? 60 years separates these two cars and they're completely different, but at the same time they're the same. And more so, every other Porsche is designed to look like an offshoot of the 911, but the 911, remember, is designed to look like a modern interpretation of a 60-year-old 911. But that's what Porsche do. They're a little bit quirky and they're a little bit old-fashioned, but they also embrace the future, and that's what their customers love. And then there's the Porsche 917. Now this was a car that dominated the World Sportscar Championship and the Can-Am series to a point where it was basically outlawed from both. But it was all built around a chassis that was basically old technology when it first debuted in 1969. Again, this was Porsche embracing the future while also being a little bit old-fashioned. You see, the 917 used a tube frame chassis, whereas most other manufacturers in both sports car racing and open-wheeler racing had switched to a monocoque design like years earlier. The 917 chassis was basically an updated 908 chassis, but built from alloy instead of steel. And for what it was really light. The whole chassis weighed just 42 kilograms. Now part of the reason they managed to get it so light was because they made it so compact. Now that's a great thing if you're an engineer, but not so much if you're a driver, because in the case of the 917, your feet were in front of the front axle line. And you can probably guess why that's not really ideal. But on a positive note, these things were so fast that it basically didn't matter. You see, in 1971, a Porsche 917 reached 386 kilometers an hour on the Mulsanne Straight at Le Mans. Now, if you're doing 386k an hour and you hit something in a 917, it doesn't really matter if your feet are in front of or behind the front axle line. You're buggered either way. And then there's the alloy pipe that the chassis was constructed from. It was so thin that there was some concerns from the engineers that it could crack. So Porsche filled the chassis in the early cars with pressurized gas. And a pressure gauge was mounted on the dash so that the driver could see if the chassis had cracked. So in a way, that was like a 917 safety feature, which is quite nice. Now, believe it or not, the 917 was actually slightly overweight, so Porsche built a chassis from magnesium. This was chassis 917053. Now magnesium is very light, but it's also extremely flammable and it burns really hot. And it's almost impossible to extinguish. So it's actually really dangerous, and you really don't want to be inside a car that's made from magnesium. But also, the Porsche engineers couldn't be sure that the magnesium chassis wouldn't break during the race, because magnesium is also quite brittle. And as you'd expect, this might be cause for concern for the drivers. But Porsche engineers had the perfect solution. They elected not to tell them. Now, one of the drivers of chassis 053 was Dr. Helmut Marko, who these days runs the Red Bull Junior Driver program. Now, people say that Marko is too tough on the kids in the Red Bull program, but when Marko was a kid, he drove a magnesium 917, and his engineers didn't even tell him. The chassis 053 raced just once at Le Mans in 1971. It won the race, and then it was immediately retired. Now, although the chassis itself was a little bit leery and a little bit old-fashioned, the Porsche 917 was actually a fantastic car. It was powered by a 4.5 litre flat 12 motor producing 540 horsepower, and later models had a 4.9 litre motor producing 600 horsepower. The motor itself was strong and reliable, and the driveline and the rest of the components were also strong. So while the chassis was a little bit scary, pretty much everything else was pretty good, except initially the aerodynamics. That took a little while to get sorted, and in fact the early cars were basically undrivable. But Porsche won the World Sportscar Championship in 1969, 1970 and 71. And they also won the Le Mans 24 Hours in 1970 and 71. And then the FIA changed the regulations for 1972, so the 917's 5 litre motor was no longer eligible. But despite the chassis being an outdated design, it was actually really adaptable. Like most European manufacturers, Porsche really wanted to make it big in the United States. So they teamed up with Penske Racing to run the 917 in the Can-Am series. Now, Porsche was already supporting a sort of a low-key Can-Am effort with a 917 Spider, which was being driven by Joe Siffert. Now, this was a pretty basic, normally aspirated car, and it wasn't really very successful. The result of the Porsche-Penske partnership was the 917-10. It had a 900 horsepower twin turbocharged version of the 5-litre flat 12, and it took a heap of design and testing work to get it right. One area that really differed on the Can-Am car was the new nose design that it featured. Now, Penske Racing driver and engineer Mark Donohue was heavily involved in this. In fact, he's heavily involved in developing the whole car. You see, the 917-10 featured a massive rear wing mounted way out the back, and it produced so much downforce it was lifting the front. Now, up to that point, most racing sports cars just featured a long tapered nose that sort of was designed to slice cleanly through the air. Now, these guys tried everything until they just started cutting the nose back to the point where it just about followed the contours of the front wheels and the radiator duct. And then they added a splitter. Now, that nose was so advanced that even today's modern sports racing cars still follow a similar concept. It doesn't look like it'll work, but it just does. Now, while they were developing the 917-10, Donohue leased a McLaren M8F and had it shipped to Germany so that the Porsche engineers could inspect it. This was effectively the opposition. Now, he said that they basically started pulling the monocoque chassis apart expecting to find a tube frame chassis inside. They just loved their tube frame chassis. Now, the Penske Porsche won the 1972 Can-Am series and finally defeated McLaren, who dominated the series since 1967.
Mark, knowing he is driving the superior machine, enjoys his advantage and sprints away from the field.
For the 1973 Can-Am, Penske and Porsche developed the 917-30. Now, this used a lengthened chassis similar to the 16-cylinder 917, but with a twin turbocharged flat 12 that was now out to 5.4 litres. It produced 1200 horsepower, and it won the Can-Am series again. In 1975, a 917-30 set the world closed course land speed record at 221 miles an hour with a top speed of 241 miles an hour, and this was achieved at Talladega Superspeedway. Now, that was pretty brave considering Donohue had first-hand experience of what happens when you crash a 917. But wait! What was that about a 16-cylinder 917? Yes, indeedy. Porsche built a special 917 with a flat 16 motor in a lengthened chassis that was created basically as a possible alternative to the turbocharged Can-Am car. That's 16 cylinders. Now, Mark Donohue test drove this car in 1971, basically right at the beginning of the Porsche-Penske relationship. He reckoned the motor was so long that you could actually hear one end start up before the other. Now, even though the car wasn't properly set up and had basically been pulled out of a barn, he was hugely impressed with its straight line punch. So, Porsche produced the 917 using an outdated chassis, but in the end they won championships with a normally aspirated flat 12, a twin turbocharged flat 12, and they also produced a 16-cylinder version. So yeah, that chassis was pretty adaptable. After the 917 was outlawed, Porsche returned to the World Sportscar Championship in 1975 with the 936. And now, finally, they embraced change and they used a monocoque chassis, right? Wrong. The 936 was basically an updated 917, but with a smaller turbocharged motor and better aerodynamics. It wasn't until 1982 in the 956 that Porsche finally embraced a monocoque chassis design, a full 20 years after Colin Chapman at Lotus Cars had first introduced the concept to the world. But hey, that's just Porsche. They're a little bit quirky and a little bit old-fashioned, but they still basically won at everything they did. Anyway, that's it for this video, guys. Thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate you tuning in. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and the subscribe button and hit that little bell thingy so you'll get a notification when I post a new video. Anyway, we will catch you next time. Thanks so much. Catch you then. Bye-bye.